Hello and welcome. My name is Ivan Kiergan, and today I'm joined by August Flanagan and Adam Gross. August is a friend that has started multiple companies and has a side project that's doing so well he's considering turning into a full-fledged startup and is wondering how to dial up sales. To date, everything has been inbound. When I think about all of the developer-facing startups out there run by engineers that want to do more sales, this seems to me like an incredibly valuable conversation. So if you're in this position, you're in luck, because Adam Gross is going to teach us a masterclass, a crash course on how to consider dialing up sales at early stage developer facing companies. And so Adam, I met him early at Dropbox back in 2010 where he was running sales. He's invested in multiple developer facing companies, was serving as the CEO for Heroku at one point. And we just dive in to try to understand about pricing and product and positioning and onboarding and support and hiring a sales team and enterprise. We just go really deep. And so I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thank you. Adam Gross and August Flanagan, thanks guys for joining us.
Nice to be here. Thanks a lot for taking the time, Adam.
My pleasure.
So the goal today is just to dive into Cronitor sales and marketing to understand, you're an early stage startup. So why don't we start with like an introduction about what you do? It also would be helpful to understand a bit about your background. I'm just going to presume you are 100% competent everything on the engineering side, because we're not going to cover that today. So it's more like, what is your sales and marketing background, just to understand how to calibrate this?
Yeah, that sounds great. So maybe I can just jump in by giving like a quick overview of how I got to be working on Cronitor, how it came to be. So I've been working as an engineer for most of my career. And about 6 years ago, I started working on a company called Rickshaw with our mutual friend that we were talking about earlier, Gautam. And during that time, like, it was a last mile delivery service. And very quickly, like, we went from like one backend job, which was a cron job at the time, because it's the fastest thing to set up when you're running off one server, to like 20 of those. And we decided we needed like to figure out some solution for monitoring them. And we're just in a hurry to move quick. And so I started just like pinging a few friends, asking them like what they were doing for this. And it just happened that two people that I reached out to real early on, the first two people I actually asked, both told me, oh, actually, this is a problem I have today. Like, I also need this thing. Like, I had a database backup job that didn't actually run for a month, and I didn't realize that until 3 days ago. Or, oh yeah, I just like got out of a debrief with the team, and a bunch of backend tasks weren't running, and we like lost $500,000 in leads. And so those were like the two conversations that happened, maybe within like 48 hours of deciding I needed something for our backend monitor or background monitoring at Rickshaw. And so my co-founder and I, he was one of those two people I talked to. He and I started putting together just something for myself to use and for him to use, and then sold our first two paying customers and Baby List, where I later became the CTO, and that's part of the story here. My wife had started, and so they are a team of about 6, and we're facing the same problem. That was the database backup issue. And so those became our first two paying users. And so turning into sort of how that, turning towards sales and marketing and sort of our approach there, at the time of building it, it was very much just a side project, but it was also because we had just kind of gotten these nibbles on, with my co-founder being like, oh yeah, like I can get this approved at Zillow. I need this. We were talking about this in a team meeting today. And my wife saying, oh yeah, like our engineering team faced this problem at Babylist just a couple of weeks ago. We got 2 customers right away. So Zillow and Babylist. And then we knew, kind of taking our background, Shane and I, we knew that we could probably do fairly well at SEO in the extremely, extremely tiny niche that is cron job monitoring. So we looked at like who shows up number 1 for the term cron job monitoring, cron monitoring, monitor cron jobs, monitoring Linux cron jobs, etc. And it just didn't seem like there was actually any competition for those terms. It seemed like some really straightforward SEO practices: write good content, have good page markup, get a few links, was probably going to be all it would really take to quickly climb the ranks to number 1. And so that turned out to be the case, and that is how we kind of grew Cronitor as a side project for the last 6 years. So during that time, we invested in SEO. We invested in things to tooling, to do marketing tooling to draw users to our site. And we made a better product, and just kept taking feedback from users and chipping away at it. And so that brings us to where we are today. We had just a little shy of 500 paying customers. We'll cross that, I guess, probably later this month or early next month. And we're at about 28,000 in monthly recurring revenue. Our goal was to hit 30,000 by the end of this year. We started at, I think, 19,000. And so this is our first year of actually really working on Cronitor full time. For me, it's been about 4 months now. And for my co-founder, it's been about actually only 2 weeks now, or a week and a half now. So, really our goals this year were to kind of get our feet under ourselves, figure out like what's the direction that we really want to take Cronitor over the next couple of years? What are some realistic sales goals? And like, what can we do actually? Just like, if we're going to spend time working on this, what can we do to grow it faster? Because it was not, as a side project for 6 years, there was never any, really pressure for high growth, and it was really just kind of consistency and chipping away at it that got it to where it was. And so the question is like, what do we do now to go from, if you go over, the 6 year time period, I guess we've probably averaged around like $540 a month new net MRR. And this year, I think we're averaging a little bit around 1,000 right now for the last few months. And like, what can we really do to like continue to bend that growth curve by actually, starting to do sales and marketing beyond what we've done today, which is, like I said, SEO and tooling for developers.
Yeah, that was a great background. I would actually love to hear what Adam's first questions are, and we could dive in from there.
I'm curious to get a sense of just kind of the overall scale of the operation. What you're kind of comfortable disclosing in terms of number of customers. And I'm taking from your statement that most of your acquisition is occurring through SEO.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to answer your first question. Is we have about 500 paying customers right now. And so then in terms, some of those are teams that have 20, 30, 40 users on them, and some of them are just individual paying users. So I would say probably, several thousand people who are actually using Cronitor like regularly to do monitoring. And then like in scale in terms of operation, like on a technical side, we sort of do two things, right? You can send telemetry data to us, so we can, pings that we ingest, or you can schedule uptime monitoring and schedule checks that pings we send to you. And so we do I think we ingest about 30 million pings a day right now. So inbound, that's like the telemetry pings that we're receiving from customers. And I think we're doing like around a third of that in outbound uptime checks, or maybe a little bit less than that.
And then my next question is just to kind of set things up, what problem are you trying to solve?
Based
on your intention.
That's right. Yeah. So first and foremost, observability of background jobs. And this is actually like
a product problem. I mean, you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In terms of your business.
Gotcha.
Of the many sales and marketing or just business challenges that you have, opportunities you have, what are you trying to solve?
Yeah. Great question.
Change or fix.
Yeah. So I would say, I guess I have a hypothesis that is still fairly untested, though I'm starting to see some evidence that this is true, that at this point, like, there is enough product market fit. There isn't enough of a need for Cronitor as it stands today as a product without, deep changes or anything revolutionary, that I think we could easily grow our customer base by 10x with the current product if we were reaching customers and actually like moving them through our sales funnel more efficiently. My hypothesis is that we actually are really only reaching like a handful of really, I would say I have a hypothesis that the users who are converting today are actually just like a very small percentage of the people who are looking at Cronitor and actually need to use it. And they're sort of like weighed down by two things. They're weighed down by the overhead, the investment overhead in integration. And well, I guess that's actually, so I guess that I have two hypotheses. One is that there's like a serious integration challenge, and that the amount of time that it takes a customer to integrate with Cronitor right now is like prohibitively expensive. And so we're actually only capturing a small number of the users of our existing channels that we could if we were doing a better job at making it easier to integrate Cronitor into your system. And then I guess the second problem I'm trying to solve is maybe more just a question to answer, which is like, how do I, like, what is the process for starting to do more outbound sales, I guess, or even with the leads that were coming in, like what is the right thing to be doing to start to actually drive more of like a sales funnel that is not just self-serve, maybe send us a support question asking us how to do something here or there, and otherwise put in a credit card and do this if you decide that it's something you want. Like what are like the first steps to starting to like provide more education, more hand-holding, and really understand maybe the scope of what we could grow to with our existing marketing channels or with some additional marketing channels that would give us like similar audience reach that we have today.
Okay, great. So broadly, I think you can kind of break that down into three categories. One is how do you get more acquisition, which is kind of people showing up. Yeah. Two is how do you move people through your funnel, ultimately to becoming customers more quickly at a greater rate, just overall more effectively. And then third is how do you increase your kind of average customer volume? And I think it's helpful to kind of categorize the various things that you kind of suggest into one of those three buckets as a way of also trying to think about, ultimately what problem are you trying to solve, and kind of equally importantly, what problems are you trying to solve in what order? And I think, in the kind of discipline of marketing and sales, if not product, there's a virtually infinite number of things you can do. And what you choose not to do and what you choose to focus on is perhaps the most important. And of the many, the good news is I've seen a lot of things, and bad news, I've seen a lot of things go wrong. So I've got a pretty good set of anti-patterns that I like to share. And I think there's a common approach in kind of technical startupdom, which is to kind of treat marketing generically. I don't think that you're by any means falling into this trap. My sense is that you're probably a little more lean and bootstrapped. I don't know if you have venture backing. But especially when you have a bunch of VC sloshing around, there's a tendency to just kind of go build a marketing function and then go do all the marketing things and then ask questions, right? As opposed to kind of think very, very intentionally about kind of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to solve for. I'll pick one of the things that you mentioned as an example, just to start with. So, should you hire salespeople? And so, okay, and should you do more outbound? Okay, well, implicitly, if not explicitly, that's solving a higher customer lifetime value problem, right? Because the cost of a sale is going to be really large. I mean, the potentially depending on the sale, right, can go up to tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars. Not that's going to be the case here, but it's still considerable. In certainly a step function above kind of where you are on your current pricing. So by definition, the deals have to be much, much larger in order to support those kinds of motions. And so then the next question I ask myself is, okay, looking at your product and your pricing and your packaging, are you on a trajectory to support that? And at a, call it ballpark annual, max deal size of, roughly $2,500 a year, right? That you can barely afford to answer a support ticket economically at that kind of deal size. So the very short answer is you don't have the product yet to support that motion. And, lots of things we could talk about to maybe help you get there, but so that by definition kind of precludes that as something you can optimize on now. I would strongly encourage you to think about it. I don't know in what order. Again, that's kind of a broader bucket of how are you ultimately creating and capturing more value for these organizations.
Is there some back of the envelope math for what would work here? Because I've heard various stats. So you have like on target earnings of a typical sales rep, and you have I forgot what the number is, but there's how much business a rep brings in versus how much they cost. And I've heard ratios of like 10x. And so if you're earning like on target earnings of like 200K and there's 10x, then that's $2 million of new business brought in of annual revenue. Are there rules of thumb here? Because what you just said kind of spells this out, which is that if you're bringing in one customer at 2,500 yearly, then you would have to close a very, very large number of customers for that math to all add up. I mean, that's, like 100 customers a year, which would be very, very frequent of a pace. Is that correct, Adam? Are there like thresholds here that can help guide?
I think, in the broadest rule of thumb, and to really measure that right, you need to know what the lifetime value of the customer is, not what the first year value is. So it's kind of hard to just say the math. But broadest rule of thumb is that a rep's quota should be $1 million. So a rep should be bringing in $1 million. Now that's a fully burdened rep, which means that they will probably have a sales engineer associated with them. And I'm kind of blurring, and we could spend a lot of time talking about the right way to think about kind of high transaction inside models and what have traditionally been more enterprise outside models. But anything where you're on an inbound model, it means you have a reasonably efficient mechanism for generating demand. A little bit implicit in your kind of framing was that this is something that's going to be a little more kind of demand generating as opposed to demand satisfying, so a little more enterprisey. And so, yeah, all things being equal, that's, $1 million a rep. In startupdom, or just in general, I've seen that swing as low as 500K. In super early days, that's going to go even lower. Then again, in high transaction businesses, where it's more of a self-serve assist, I've seen that number be as high as 10 million per rep. So kind of depends. Yeah, I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think the way I've seen it, I have not been able to picture a very clear path forward for us in the next 12 months where that is the thing that, like hiring a dedicated salesperson to do outbound sales makes sense. I think, oh, go ahead.
I'll take a big step back. So I have a whole spiel about different kind of sales frameworks and go-to-marketing frameworks. You are absolutely right now pursuing bottoms-up, developer first, go-to-market, which great. That's one of my favorites. I think that's a fantastic way to go, and the world has shown that you can build really, really, really big businesses based on that. The thing about that model, kind of in its full glory, is it tends to have 3 adjacent but distinct modes that have their own kind of metrics and kind of processes, and even to some extent organizations associated with them. So the first mode is free adoption, right? And so you think about it just the same way you would a sales function or just kind of a business function, I guess I should say, that like the entire focus of this thing is to get as many people engaged free using your thing, something that Yvonne certainly spent a lot of his career, at least when I worked with him, focused on, right? That is a discrete, independent thing. Then adjacent to that, you have kind of the self-serve, how do I get people to acquire this thing, to buy it, to purchase it in a high volume, kind of low friction way as possible. And then adjacent to that is, when and if you're ready, building a more traditional kind of enterprise go-to-market. And typically the way these things work is you build your free thing, then you layer on your paid thing, then you layer on your enterprise thing. And I wouldn't even begin to think, rules vary. And when I think about this, I sometimes call it the Goldilocks go-to-market, because a lot of it is choosing when to employ or build kind of the different functions as opposed to if. And my rule of thumb, all things being equal, is don't start building enterprise until you're at least $1 million ARR. And I'm sorry, 10 million ARR. And you're not. So I wouldn't even put it on the map, because for a whole bunch of reasons. One, you need to, in the bottoms-up model, the reason why it works is because you're acquiring and maturing your customers in a much more efficient manner than you would through just traditional enterprise-only go-to-market. So you have to have a pretty big funnel of free and kind of team self-serve users to be able to work up from to convert. Right. You just go straight to enterprise, it's so unbelievably expensive from a customer acquisition point of view. And even worse, it's so expensive from a organization point of view, because it's not just about the enterprise rep, it's about everything in that relationship that kind of goes with it. I sometimes think about this. It's like the difference between being in a meal kit business versus a restaurant. Self-serve is meal kit, right? The burden's on the customer to kind of make the thing work. Enterprise is restaurant. You are responsible for everything, from is the napkin folded correctly to were they able to park successfully and conveniently when they came to your restaurant. So you have to have a whole organization that's set up to kind of service an enterprise in the way that they expect. So there's no like, oh, let me just hire a rep and I'm now in the enterprise business. It's a whole holistic, and obviously you have to have the product go with that. So yeah, I would think about these things as 3 different modes. So for you, when I look at your business, I think, okay, how do you optimize free and how do you optimize self-serve?
Yeah. I think, and that's, certainly with the 2 things that we have worked on over the past 6 years is those 2 things. And I guess then that gets to sort of the thing I was bringing up earlier is like, it's a hypothesis that if the integration was much easier, right, that the self-serve would that there's more to untap from that self-serve market, right?
I'll critique you a little bit on how you're doing on the free front.
Okay.
So free is very different from trial.
Yeah,
right?
okay, right, interesting.
These things are not synonymous. Now, that doesn't mean that trial's bad. It doesn't mean that all businesses should have free.
Mm-hmm.
But kind of where you're at with a pretty discrete kind of, targeted specific value proposition, that lends itself well to free, as opposed to, with trial, it's typically what you have as a trial into a team self-serve sell, which usually, again, has a ballpark it at like a 10K annual average contract value. So I think you're a little bit betwixt and between on that front.
Yeah.
And I look at your pricing page and it says start your 14-day free trial, right? You're leaning heavily into trial. You're not leaning into free adoption. Mm-hmm. And I see kind of buried, you say on the bottom, create a single monitor for free, no credit card required. It's kind of like, why bury the lead? If you're having integration problems, which in a way means you're having problem getting people to make the investment necessary to learn and integrate and use your product, well then set the commitment bar lower. So, maybe they'd be more inclined to do that, or maybe offer, right, well, you get this free thing over here, maybe I'll be more inclined to like, change the value exchange a little bit. So, I mean, that's not going to solve anything, but I do think that will open up a bunch of possibilities for you. Kind of crazy, right? Your top message in the biggest font isn't Cronitor is going to make you not lose your data, or Cronitor is going to help you, make sure all your systems run effectively, or Cronitor is going to deliver you your 5th 9. What it says is start your 14-day free trial. Right? So it's kind of like, I get that you want to make money, but
it's really good feedback.
Like I'm just clicking around and I'm like, oh, I get it. This place has something to sell, but I don't have any idea why I give a shit.
Yeah.
So,
The analogy that I love is of, so you have Mario and you have the flower, and then you have like the fireballs, right? And so you can imagine pricing on the flower, but really what you're selling is like the fireballs. So it's like you're selling the superpower that comes with it. And it's a very user value centric perspective that, and people are obsessed with themselves. So it works really, really well because like, I want superpowers. Like tell me where to click and start the integration. There's also something interesting here with the integration costs, because if I think there's no barrier, tell me about the step function of like integrating, like monitoring one thing versus like 50 things. I presume there's not much
of a difference, or
I presume that first step is like 90% of the way as far as the integration required.
Well, so you would think that, and that can be true. So there's sort of 2 or 3 paths. That's definitely what should be the case. Doing 1 and doing 50 should be the same, basically. That's not true today unless you're actually using Cron itself. So, and a lot of our users aren't using Cron itself. They're using some other, backend task system or task system that works similarly, but maybe it's distributed, maybe it's queue-based or whatever. But it still has these same fundamental challenges. And so for them, it's actually a lot more manual work. It's them, committing code often to set up this integration. And so for any job they want to create, it's at this point, can be, they might script something against our API to do that during like a deployment pipeline. So now they're putting tasks into an engineer's, queue, saying like, this week, your job is to integrate with Cronitor, and here are the steps. Every time a cron tab file is deployed, we want it to, or maybe that's a bad example, but anytime whatever our scheduled task system is deployed and there are new tasks, you should create a monitor in Cronitor, do this little work of the integration, and that's the commit. And so that's maybe a week of work for an engineer, right? Or at least a couple of days of work for an engineer. And so that is how I think a lot of our users first start working on Cronitor. They've either they themselves or somebody on their team has vetted Cronitor and said, this looks like something we need. I want to try this out. Your job is to get this running on a sandbox environment. And if you're using Cron, it's pretty simple. You can do, like you said, a couple commands and you can do 1 or 50 quickly. But if it's something else, you might spend a couple of days doing that integration work.
I have another question for Adam here, just as far as sort of in between where he is now, or where Cronitor is now, and where you might go at 10 million ARR, dialing some enterprise value up. And there's certainly more to say as far as like the onboarding and the pricing and the positioning for this. But what are, if the hypothesis around having more value from certain teams, there's this notion of like for qualifying some users, some people entering the funnel, that this is actually going to be an important contract, that what it's more that August could do to help close that deal, which would be a little bit like the advice of founders doing their own sales before they spin up the function of the team to do it. And that's presumably good practice. It's a good idea to even know if it's possible. And so what does that look like? Is it just proactively looking at the size of the company, the number of engineers? Like there's a whole qualification question there. And then there's what happens. Is it just a phone call? Like, what is the like white glove treatment?
In terms of how do you kind of create that next order value proposition?
Yeah. Like what's that relationship look like that's different than self-serve, like the first things that are more active?
So once you're at like a 10 million ARR business, how do you kind of think about building that enterprise spoke?
No. So if before that, and this is my presumption, it might be wrong. Tell me if you disagree.
You're asking exactly my question. Elon.
Yeah. So I think August is thinking I should do more here, but only for some people. And so somebody comes in and it's like an engineer that has a side project. You might think that's not a real company. But if there's another Zillow that comes in that could be like a similar, larger contract with more engineers, there's something different that he should do. And there's first identifying what those are. And then second would be like how that relationship is driven, like what kinds of processes are put in place to be able to manage it. And then this is all before you're dialing up anything on the enterprise side, because it's just more like, if he were to spend some of his time on working on product for integration or some of his time on customer support and proactive customer support, like what are the motions that he should be doing?
I mean, hard for me to say in specific terms, given kind of my lack of intimacy with your business, but in general terms, as an example, a common question or issue that companies wrestle with is how to think about support in this model, in this bottoms-up model. And, one of the first things people like to do is say, okay, well, support's expensive, let's cut that back, or let's, support's a cost, how do we limit that? Especially where you are right now, I would lean in heavily. So like I would hire an extra support rep before I hired a sales rep, right? Because that's probably the single most important thing you can do to, if you've got somebody who's kind of like made it through your pricing page and like engaged with your thing and is taking the energy to actually email you, they are so far down the funnel. If you're, applying a little bit of energy from kind of a broad marketing spend cost point of view is like, that's some of the most effective things you can do. So I would.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I'm rabid about our customer support when somebody isn't a signed up user in some way and they're not yet paying us money. We try to like email within minutes is our goal.
Yeah. I mean, support is marketing, docs are marketing. Right? All these things are some of the more important things you can do in a self-serve, especially developer customer acquisition model. There's a, there are all kinds of important things about being able to qualify your free or even kind of individual self-serve community to be able to know which are the most important ones to follow up on. Doing things like, it's hard often to find out what companies they work at, but sometimes you can, and aggregating those up together so you can identify the pockets of usage within a company, and then try and do kind of a roll-up motion on top of that. That becomes really, really important, especially over time. That's why companies like Clearbit do so well, because they can kind of help backfill that data. But the model is predicated on getting a lot of people in the door and converting a relatively low percentage of them. So not answering your question, and I want to make sure I do actually answer your question, but this is actually something that's come up a bunch in companies I work with recently, where we've kind of debated whether it makes sense to sell anything to individuals, whether there should be any individual value proposition at all. And I'm sorry, not any individual value proposition, but any individual monetization. And I probably would, I'd be very curious to see if you get away without that.
Yeah, when you say that, like when you're thinking about Cronitor, if you're looking at our pricing plan, you're thinking like drop that individual, that $49 plan. Like if you just focus this on teams. Yeah, that's really interesting. That is something that my co-founder and I, not specifically of should we drop this plan, but certainly is something that we have recognized in our business and talked about a lot, which is that really the value, when we get value back from our users, money, the reason they're actually paying us more money, it has nothing really to do with the cron job monitoring. That works the same regardless of what plan you're on, right? There's no product differentiation. You don't get better cron job monitoring by paying us more money. You just get team features that make it a little bit easier to add users, deal with billing, lock down people from certain areas, that sort of thing. And that's absolutely what people pay us money for. So that's a really interesting thought.
I've been trying to think about if, let's just, hypothesize that the startup plan is free. Also, I don't love startup as a plan name, because that describes a business type. It doesn't really kind of describe. I would prefer something like free team enterprise, like assuming we went with this model.
Like three.
But and maybe you turn down the number of monitors you get, or maybe you kind of play with features. But conversely, then I would try and bump the team price. Another company I work with, it's funny, I was chatting with the CEO. They were selling to a publicly traded tech company we all know, and like they were getting something like $3,000 a year from them, and it for multi-user use case. And it's like, for an organization of any size, the difference between spending $3,000 a year and spending $10,000 a year is literally immaterial, right? There's like, I mean, in the IT or dev budget domain, even in the ops domain, like, ask yourself the question of the companies you're talking to, what are they spending on logging and monitoring? The answer is probably 7 figures, or at least 6, right?
Definitely, We know, some of our customers, who I won't name on here because they've asked us.
And the great thing is
their names are,
you sell to an ops value proposition, which is ops is where the money is. So it's like, man, I bet there's more than $100 a month of team value that is sitting on the table there. And I don't know, I'm speculating, but this is where you can make real shifts in your business, and it's less of a local maximization and more kind of a holistic thinking. Is there an opportunity to just kind of rebalance this whole system that's much, much more focused on, later stage, slightly larger monetization that will kind of hopefully just grease the wheels of the whole thing?
I'm curious what your take is on retroactively changing prices on current customers. Like, can you go to everyone on the team tier saying, hey, it's $250 now, sorry. Like, how do you do that?
Anybody who worked with me at Heroku carries a fair amount of scars from all of our repricing efforts. Now, Heroku pricing was incredibly complicated because of our diversity of products and the fact that we metered by the second, and like changing pricing was existential. It was all good and it all worked and was all the right thing. So changing pricing is hard for sure. I would, for your free users, I would, or for your startup users, I would potentially look at foregoing that revenue if it wasn't so bad. And for team, you grandfather people in. One of the key things about when you make pricing changes is to make sure. I did a little work with GitHub about 2 years ago, and like they didn't do this, and it was slightly chaotic. They subsequently cleaned things up. When you change your pricing and you're grandfathering people into an old plan, make sure you set expectations from the get-go that they won't get any new features, right? Because that's a fair trade, and most people are okay with that. But if you kind of make it slippery and you're not explicit about that, all hell will break loose when you let that kind of debt accrete. And it's a lot of work, and it's billing work, and it's provisioning work, and so you got to decide if it kind of makes sense. But
you don't give new features to people in that grandfathered pricing tier?
Yep, because you want them to move to the new tier. So like if they're getting a deal, unless it's more expensive, then obviously you want to give them, if you're lowering prices, then you give them the benefit of that. Well, if all of a sudden you change team to $200 a month instead of $100 a month, I would strongly recommend you do that in concert with some additional capability. And then everybody who's grandfathered say, great, you're grandfathered for the next year or whatever, and but you're not getting any of the new features, which is, again, in my experience, a very reasonable trade-off. So they have incentive to upgrade, and they don't feel like this is, just there isn't any kind of appropriate exchange in value.
Yeah, that's interesting. When you said that, there's a couple of features that we're working on that just popped into my mind immediately of like, oh, these are so big that these could be either one of these or both of these could be like things that you could tie that to potentially.
Yeah, I don't love having a lot of, I think you should only have 3 prices, but if you had to, you could always kind of carve a new plan in there somehow. But the trick is really, you're not going to build the business of your dreams at $250 a month, right? You really, I say that with the humility of like, it's very important that there's a appropriate individual value proposition, but you have to always be thinking about how do you kind of, lever up the value. For you, all of that should be focused really on team. I mean, in some ways you should have 2 products, right? You should have free and team. You're a small enough business that, maybe there's like a little escape valve, contact us for everything else. But like focusing on running those 2 businesses is hard enough for companies at reasonable scale, far larger than where you are now. So like just make those things work and make them work great in a way that really, really, kind of hums, and then worry about adding some kind of new value proposition on the end of that.
Yeah.
There's a question implicit to some of the things you're describing as far as the free tier of people coming on and then the right kind of people expanding from that into the team side. And so, just one bit of advice is just to track this. And so if you don't already, in terms of expansion from one tier to the other.
Yeah.
But is there also like a rule of thumb here on the decision for making the startup tier free? So for example, it might be a small percentage of your business, so doesn't take the revenue hit, or it might be a very large conversion rate to the higher tiers, which means that even if it's 50% of your business by customers, it's by revenue, not going to stay that way if you look at it longitudinally. Yep. Yeah, there's probably some ways of slicing the data to see that.
Yeah, I think so. What from our existing data would you look at? I don't have it in front of me, but I do have this data somewhere of conversion rates from our it used to be called solo, to your point of not like startup from our startup plan to our team plan, and it's somewhere around like 7 to 9% of team plans started on. Actually, it might be a little bit more than that. Call it 10% of team plans start on the solo plan.
It's kind of fascinating because that's a pretty low number.
Yeah.
It's a pretty low number to go from like as a tier graduation. That tells you that a lot of people are going direct to team, which also probably tells you there's lower price sensitivity.
Yeah. And so for that $99 is probably not, like, clearly there's not, we haven't hit any price sensitivity with that yet.
I'd be curious why they're going straight to team. And I presume it's multiple users, not number of monitors.
It's multiple users. And we do see users who upgrade through the path because they're on the monitor path, but it's mostly about users.
Right. Like anybody who cares about monitoring something with your product has multiple people with like SRE or pseudo SRE responsibilities.
That's
So by definition, there needs to be kind of more than one person involved in that kind of resolution workflow. And it's just kind of an interesting way of looking at it, which is, again, why there's so much more value on the multi-user side, kind of multiplayer mode, that you can really turn up the contrast on. And there are all kinds of ways of thinking about what you do, maybe slightly differently, right? That the value isn't in the monitoring, the value is in the resolution. And you're enabling that by virtue of you're allowing multiplayer Cron, which is amazing, right? Like that doesn't exist in Unix in the world unless you build it yourself through some crazy thing. And that's a problem, right? That's like, oh my God, you created multi-user Cron. Oh my God, that's a big deal.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I like that. That is definitely the product direction. We have some building to do.
So one thing we've talked about before, and I'd love to hear Adam's view on this, is the investing side of this, because you have rules of thumb like, hey, if you hit this MRR, then you can earn this level of seed. There's also things like going through an accelerator and with the kinds of work that you do in that time to try to make those numbers go up. And there's also having the function built out when you're pitching, or pitching saying we're going to build out this function. So there's this relationship between the resources that you get from fundraising, what you are expected to do in that time, like after you've taken that money, and that's from raising a seed and going towards another seed or an A, or going through an accelerator and then trying to hit demo day. I'd be curious to have your take, Adam, on how they should think about fundraising with respect to just the strategy here.
Yeah. Well, the first question is, do you want to fundraise? And I don't think that that's always an obvious yes, nor should it be. So
yeah, and my answer would be, I don't know yet.
Yeah, and that's a whole separate question. But assuming the answer to that is yes, what you need to show is what counts at your stage is adoption and market, not revenue. In a way, revenue is a anti-pattern, because an investor investing in your stage is asking the question, how big can this business be? Not how do you get a lot of people to spend $49. And so you're kind of anchoring them. Any revenue at this stage has the effect of being a low revenue anchor.
Right.
So, and even kind of a low opportunity anchor, because there's only so much value you could possibly be creating right now. So what you want to show is that you have a path to engage and acquire people that you ultimately can, translate into some much higher value thing, which I think, given the fact that you're in ops, you're in a super high value space, right? All this is like, right? You're basically kind of in observability and logging, which is like one of the hottest spaces you possibly could be in. All of that is kind of wind at your back. You just need to show that you have an entree into that with a couple of reasonable ideas about how you then can capture larger value there. But step one is always, how are you acquiring people and how are you getting people interested in the thing?
And, so the answer today, right, being SEO, tooling, content tooling, content marketing that are tools for developers. If I was telling you that and sitting and pitching that to you, how would you respond to that? Are those things that are really interesting because they're obviously things that are evergreen? They're going to, assuming Google doesn't all of a sudden deeply penalize us in some way, we're going to continue to have that going? Or is that, it's also very passive, I guess, is the other thing that maybe if there's a concern, it's like the things that we're doing now are very passive on the marketing and acquisitions.
So the kind of a different question, which is more of like a developer marketing question, which is what kind of acquisition techniques are helpful in developer marketing? And clearly, SEO helps. Content marketing is obviously perhaps the most important thing. The thing that I would be curious about, I always look for community affinity. So all developer products tend to have, all the great ones, right, tend to have kind of some implicit community affinity, at least to start, right? It's peanut butter and chocolate story. So, right, Heroku was kind of Heroku Rails. GitHub was Git and GitHub, right? So there's these kind of, there's another company in the testing space I'm involved with now, Cypress, which is all about kind of testing the new generation of front-end JavaScript. So, right, that's going to be React, that's going to be that whole world. There probably are some natural affinities in problem domains or communities that already are naturally occurring in your business. And hypothetically, I have no idea. You mentioned databases before. Maybe it has to do with RDS. Or it has to do with Postgres. Let's say Postgres. I would triple down on that. I would triple down on like content and whatever for Postgres for that business problem. Because the reality is, even in the world of Cron, it's probably likely, and you need, to some extent, you're surfacing that right on your homepage. You're saying, well, here's Cronitor for Kubernetes or for, I'm now missing where exactly I saw that before. So you're kind of hinting at that. I would lean into that more to tap in. So if you basically write, developers operate by pattern. And what you want is to enmesh yourself to become part of whatever that pattern is. It's how do you run Kubernetes? How do you run Postgres on Kubernetes, which is a terrible idea in general? Oh, you use Cronitor to do that, right? Or whatever the answer is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've been thinking very specifically on the product direction. I don't know if this is that interesting, but very specifically on the product direction. What we've really heard of a lot is teams, or who we have heard from a lot, or most vocally, are the teams using Cron that are not the most technical teams at that company. So they might be like an analytics team that has an engineer attached to them, or it's data analysts doing a little bit of code, but they have a lot of Cron jobs. It's a lot of moving data from one place to the other. And what you said a few minutes ago is exactly what they're looking for. They're all looking for multi-user Cron because they're not super comfortable SSHing onto a server and things.
To geek out about your product a little bit, right? There's an argument that where you're headed is something like Airflow-y, you know, Dagster-y or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Which, if you have a way of reaching less technical users and providing a path to that kind of value proposition, that's hugely valuable, right? So maybe it does need to be more explicit in speaking to those people.
This seems like a good point to end on. So unless there's anything else, August.
No, I was just going to say, I know we're quite over on the time. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate this conversation, Adam.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And looks like a super interesting and fun business. So congratulations on all the success.
Thanks. Yeah. It's been fun getting into it.
This conversation also, I'm sure there are thousands of other developers in a similar position of having, probably not at your revenue level, but just like, I built this tool. Now, how do I think about sales and marketing? And so I think a lot of people are going to enjoy this. So thank you guys so much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Ivan. I really appreciate it.